in these things, so you have a better opportunity with Shekhar also today and understand all these aspects very clearly. Okay. Yes.
Attendance, it is not taking properly.
It's all right. Okay. Just leave it there. Okay. This is the on the left. Yeah. Okay, all of you, good morning. And hope you are all fresh for the next 1 hour of session. We already spoken about the definition of a project or definition of various elements of a project, especially the requirements, why requirements are important, the role of the requirements, and how do we take care about documenting them and getting them. Good. Today we'll be getting into a bit more details on what like application, whether it's a web app or an Android app or a large enterprise software is actually built. And you would be following some of the best practices of the industry in your own project, which I understand is an individual contribution. There are no multiple teams in a project. You yourself would be playing the role of, the requirement specialist, the design specialist, the developer, the tester, the integration, everything. You would be doing it. Just because the project is a solo development project doesn't mean that you don't have to follow the standard processes of a software development lifecycle. So the project lifecycle is extremely important, whether you do it as an individual project or it is a very large project. Yes, some of the activities can be trimmed down, can be cut off, but broadly you would still be doing some of the very key activities of a. Why is it called requirement engineering? Why is it called as a scope management? The reason why it is called requirement engineering is all you have is a 1 page or a 2 page of a project requirement document. That's a very, very high level. You're going to a restaurant and say, hey, I want a lunch. That doesn't mean anything. Yes, but what type of lunch? Is it a multi-course lunch? Is it a single course lunch? Does it have this? Does it have that? Everything has to be detailed. So the detailing of the project requirement document to a state what we call is as a requirements ready for development is requirements engineering. Second is you need to define what is in scope and what is not in scope. So the scope definition also creates a certain boundaries for the requirements and say that this is part of the requirement and this is not part of the requirement so that you are very clear in terms of the timeline, in terms of the money and the cost involved in executing the project, or in terms of managing your resources and timelines. So please understand that requirements engineering and scope management pretty much takes about 30% to 40% of the overall project timeline. You remember in my previous presentation of Abraham Lincoln, right? If I were to cut a tree for 6 hours, I will take 4 hours to sharpen my axe. So you need to have a very sharp axe. And the axe is nothing but a very, very clear, detailed requirements and the scope so that once you get onto the execution phase, there is no ambiguity and there is no confusion as is it part of the scope or is it not part of the scope, right? Just put a thumbs up if you have understood this. Excellent, excellent. Now, what do we do? What are the various objectives of the session? Quickly for the next 45 minutes, I will go through broad objectives. I won't get into the real detail because you're all experts in that. But what I'm going to do is sort of a refresh about the various utility building activities you would be required to do it in your project. The first activity is define scope precisely for functional and non-functional requirements. When you talk about functional requirement, these are all the business requirements. This is exactly what a particular application could be, a web app, could be an Android app, or could be any other application is expected to deliver in terms of various functionalities. So you need to be very clear about the functional. Non-functional requirements is the technology perspective of the product or the app or the software you are developing. In what technology, what database, if it is a responsive websites, what are the responses required, what are the security parameters. I'll get into small details in the next slide, but basically there is a clear demarcation between a functional requirement and a non-functional requirement. What you do with the requirements next phase is all about writing a well-defined use cases and drawing a use case diagram. Please give a thumbs up if you understand what a use case diagram and what a use case modeling is all. So everyone is an expert on that. Excellent. So I'm hoping that you can take and you would definitely take up breaking down the PRD, which is already there with you, to, to a use case diagram and use case modeling. Finally, what you also do is you will be applying the modeling techniques like user stories, UML models, data flow diagrams, state transition diagrams, state diagrams, everything you would be doing it as a part of your project. You would also be expected to deliver, build, and start using the use case template. I have created one sample template which will be shared with you. See if it makes sense to you, or you can further improve on that. But definitely that has to be something which you should be using it as a part of your requirements engineering and scope management. So you have to build the right diagramming the various use cases as a model. You need to also clearly articulate and document how an accepted scope, which is nothing but a set of use case diagrams and use case models along with the ERDs. Next step is getting into the design phase. And finally, once you have done the use case modeling and the design of it, you have to get into this final step of testing your scope to the original requirements and say, okay, this is the original requirement. These are all the 20, 30, 40, 100 use cases I have built, functional and non-functional, and everything is linked with the original PRD. There's no functionality which I have missed it out, and there is a sign up, and it is completely tested before it is gets into the next phase of design and development. So all you have is a PRD. What does it state? It articulates the business requirement. It creates the objective of that particular application you're going to build. Nothing beyond that. Maybe a high level requirement, but it doesn't get into the details of what actually does this application in terms of various business processes, various functional elements, and various technology elements to it. So you need to break down the PRD into various use cases and models. A very quick question to all of you. Can you define what is a use case, and can use cases be further broken down into smaller use cases? A quick chat for about 30 seconds. What is a use case and can it be broken down? Anybody start typing out your answers? Chat.
documents, start giving out responses. You're able to hear us, right? Hope the screen is visible, Riva. Okay.
So the chat is off.
This chat is enabled, guys.
What is the use case? When what are the broad elements it contains? That is not enough. I just check it out if you can type out the answers.
Yes, guys. Now you can give out the answers.
It describes of a user interaction, visual way of how users interact. What else? Structured description of an actor, what the user wants, system, complement solves. Yeah, fair enough. I think you broadly got a view about it. Please brush up your skills on use cases. Uh, I think use case is not necessarily a front end. Say, for example, there is a you know data processing application. There's no front end other than downloading the data. There is no user interaction. There is no UI. But there is still a lot of functional requirement which have to be executed at the back end. Every activity which works with certain actors, there is a data flow diagram. There is what is called an entity relationships, and there is a certain processing. Everything which has a very specific task to be done, like user login, it's a use case. User delete, it's a use case. User update, it's a use case. Read, write, access. It is the fundamental atomic level of breakdown of any activity which either user does or within two entities of an application does is a use case. It is the smallest level of an activity in an application. Okay, fair enough. Thank you, guys. You can stop chatting. I pretty much got what I'm looking for. So what is um, what is requirement in a use case is okay, close the chat. Yeah, you can. I think yeah, I got it. So what you're required in this case is you take your functional requirements and your PRD. In many cases, it's both the same. Start breaking down into use cases. You may not know what are those use cases are. So it's very important for you to either imagine or talk to the business user who has given you that PRD on a series of conversations. You break down the entire requirements document into a set of use case and models. This is how the users are going to interact with the application is what our use case model should do. Once the use case models are done, you need to get onto the next phase, which is called as the design phase. The design phase also talks about how do you convert the non-functional requirements to a design specific in terms of UI, in terms of technology architecture, in terms of the database, in terms of the backend, in terms of security, in terms of data access. All these are part of the design spec. You need to look for it. Finally, Once you have the use cases, the functional, the non-functional, and the design cases, you need to start writing the test cases. Nowadays, what happens is in the modern agile world of development, there is a concept called as a test-driven methodologies. The test-driven methodology is nothing but the use cases are so written that they themselves will end up playing the role of a test case. So you'll have a set of test cases. In many cases, is the same use cases, or in some cases, you can have a separate set of test cases. So your PRD, which is from section 1 to 17, needs to be expanded into use cases and models before it becomes into a design specifications, right? So this is a summary of what is a functional requirement and what is a non-functional. I just quickly repeat what I said. A functional requirement is all about what the system does. What does it behave? What are the various features? What are the various options? So it, you know, I just took an example of spend sense. We'll have add, delete, expense entries. What is the amount? What is the category? What is the date? So these are all various granular level of use cases which will happen in your web app. In case of one more scenario, I took it is like user sets monthly and weekly budgets. For this week I'm going to spend some 1,000 rupees or 2,000 rupees. That's a use case. So how do you get to that granular level of details, which is a part of an activity a user will have with the application? In case of employee performance, you are ranking an employee or rating an employee in terms of quality and timelines on a rating. There's no further breakdown of it. So that is the smallest level of use case you would be taking up. So in both the cases, you need to get into the smallest level of details and start documenting in your use case diagram and use case model document. In case of functional, non-functional, it is pretty much the overall performance of your application. How well the system behaves in terms of when it is put to use. What are the quality attributes? You can say that, functionally it is a great application, but it's a performance wise, it's a pretty bad. It's non-responsive, it hangs, it cannot handle more than 5 users. So some of these are technical limitations, not a functional limitation. So these, you have to categorize under 4 to 5 buckets. The first bucket is about performance bucket, how the application would perform. It is a high performance website or a responsive website. I don't know whether you guys are working on concepts like Node.js and other high performance development. I think some of these are comes under the performance tab of a non-functional requirement. Second is security, the access control, the data access. It compliance to the various in terms of the roles. Who has the access for delete, update, read, download. How is the sensitive data being stored? Is it an encrypted system? What is the level of encryption you are using? It's a 32-bit or a 64-bit or a 128-bit encryption. All these have to be part of the security layer of your application. So that means there is an element of cybersecurity part of your application. Third is when you talk about the portability. I know this is an Android development, so I'm not too sure which version of Android you are developing, but there is a concept called as downward compatible and upward compatible. So, for example, you are working on Android 8. That means application should work on Android 8, 7, 6. You can go to what extent you want to, and it is also going to work for Android 9 and 10 if it's already there in the market. So there is an upward integration as well as a downward integration in terms of the portability, so that you don't have to rewrite the application whenever there is a version change in the operating system. Then you have what is called the overall performance in terms of responsiveness of the app, in terms of the ability to data crunch, in terms of ability to process the data, display the data, generate reports, everything under a certain accepted, mutually accepted performance metric. So this is where you need to get your user signed off and say, hey, my website or the app will perform within 2 seconds, 3 seconds, 100 milliseconds, 20 milliseconds, whatever the business requirement is, you need to deliver and perform accordingly. Finally, when you talk about um, signing off, every requirement has to be signed off by the user, and these requirements have to be testable. That means you cannot write anything which cannot be tested. So everything requirement, functional and non-functional, have to be documented and follow the same principles of a test-driven approach towards requirements and baseline the document. So this is what a typical scope document would look like. You have 7 sections from the project overview to the scope. It is the first point. The second one is the who are the various stakeholders and people who are going to use the system, both regularly and on a weekly, or it could be on a monthly basis. Third is what is the scope of the activities of the document? What is the scope of the requirements? Where does it start? Where does it end? It also talks about the out of scope requirements. Say for example, there is something which is there, but it's not in this version. Or we clearly this is completely out of scope. This application is concerned. For example, performance dashboard you're building. Background check of an employee is not required, or it is out of scope. So some of these, you have to be very clear in terms of in scope requirements and out of scope requirements. Then you have the non-functional requirement, which is your technology, as we just spoke about. And you also need to document the various assumptions and constraints. I've spoken in my previous session in the project management, you know, sort of overview. Why assumptions and constraints are very important. You
You
cannot
cannot
come
come
back
back
maybe
maybe
middle of the
middle of the
project and
project
say,
and say,
oh,
oh,
I assumed that this is part of the scope, but it's not there. So you need to include it. No. Everything which is there, not there, assumed has to be documented. You need to also document what are the likely challenges and constraints you are going to meet while the project is underway in terms of resources, in terms of timeline, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of software licenses. Everything is a constraint which is going to hamper the overall project progress. That has to be documented and written down so that everybody is aware of the various challenges. Tomorrow they cannot say that, oh, you should have told me earlier. Finally, there is an acceptance criteria which clearly says this project is accepted only if it delivers the following criteria. So that is nothing but your final acceptance criteria. So once you start writing down the use cases, please understand that the use cases have to be at an absolute atomic level. That means the use case cannot be broken down further into any further use cases is an atomic level of use case. I've given some examples, you can go through it. But what I'm trying to tell you here is that the final use case document, which is there for acceptance, cannot be further broken down into smaller use cases. You have to get to that level of clarity and that level of documentation so that anybody can use that document and build an application. Not necessarily that you would be building it. In a large project, in large organizations, IT companies, what happens? All these are done by what is called as requirement specialist. Requirement specialist do these jobs. Nobody else does this. So requirement specialist job is to document the requirements to an extent where the use cases cannot be further documented and the requirement specialist is out of the project. The document goes to the next phase for execution and testing and deployment. So here is a sample of writing how to write an atomic test case and how to create what is called a testable functional requirement. That means a use case can also be used as a testable functional requirement. And finally, what do they get out of it? The final objective is already there in the document, which is comes back again. When you start reading the use case, you can easily find out what is the expected outcome of this particular application. Why use case is required for your build is that many a time people who write the applications are not necessarily the people who are going to build it. So that's why, you need to create a use cases which can be built either by you or by others without going back to the requirement again and again and again. You need to have a user story also. User story is an aggregate view about the user's cases. These are all the various scenarios. These are the various instances of a particular application and say, hey, I want to see a weekly report. Hey, I want to see how the trend of my expenses are happening for the last 3 months. These are nothing but scenarios which can be covered under user stories. And finally, please ensure that every use case has a design and has a testability criteria also. There is no point in having a requirement or a use case which cannot be tested. If it cannot be tested, then we have not been developed well in the system. A typical use case diagram looks like this. You can use any UML, you can use any product, but a typical use case, I just took an example and say, this is how a use case looks like to the smallest breakdown of an activity and what are the various entities and how do they interact with the user. So this is, at a very, very high level. I'm sure you guys are experts on drawing use case diagrams. Yeah, this is a bit a sort of illustrative of a system. Please note that a good, well-written use case template should have 12 fields, absolutely mandatory. You cannot do with 10, you cannot do with 8. You have to be 12 fields mandatory. You can add more fields, but you cannot go below 12 fields. This is a broad description about what a typical use case template looks like, from the use case ID to the name, to the actors, to the PRT reference, everything. And you need to start using it very, very religiously in your project. A typical use case would look like this, and this is where you need to submit it for the user acceptance. This clearly talks about what are the various actors, what are the various triggers they initiate, what are the preconditions, what are the post conditions, what is the success scenario for the use cases. This is where I've given some details about it. Please go through them. But what is equally important is that this is what is called as the completeness criteria of a typical use case. Every use case should have this, and every use case template should follow the 12-step process which I've shared. So I'm sure you can take this up, and please spend a lot of time in documenting these use cases because it's a very important skill for a good software developer in the market. So, now that which does that. If you want to do it manually, you can still do it. One is the use case diagram. There are a lot of the open source tools are available, like Figma, the Plant UML. All these are visual tools available in the market. I'll take a quick 30-second, pause. What are the various tools you are comfortable with, or you are aware of it, or you have actually started using them? I mean, any use case modeling tools, any of you are using it? Please type your answers on the chat box. No. Okay, people are using Figma. Most of them are using Figma. Excellent. Okay, seems to be a Canva. Okay. Eraser.io, Docu.io. Okay. Okay. So excellent. So you guys are good to go in terms of modeling tools and so what I'm also recommending is try and see if you can use tools where once you do the modeling, the model itself I'm not sure whether which language you're going to develop, whether it's a Python or a Java or a .NET, I don't know. But whatever be the code language you are using it, try and use a use case modeling tool which can generate code. Okay. Chaitanya talks about project management tools, but no, I'm not talking about project management tools. I'm just talking about use case modeling tools. Okay. So, yeah, I think I got a fairly good idea about what tools you are aware of it. So, all the use modeling tools along with the data flow diagram, the state transition diagrams, and the entity relation diagram, all are part of the modeling tools. Please use them very actively and see if you have already known the technology stack, see if they can be used as a code generators as well. So a typical state transition that looks like this. I'm not going to teach you state transition because you're all experts in that. You already done that in your part of a software engineering courses and other courses, modeling courses. So please have all these state transition diagrams drawn and documented, which have to be signed up by your mentor or whoever the requirement specialist are. So this example of a data flow diagram give illustrate what I'm communicating here. So you need to have three absolutely, in place: use case model, state transition diagram, entity relationship diagram, and the data flow diagrams. All are absolutely must along with your requirements document as a deliverable to the project, without which your project cannot start and it should not start. Once you submitted the document, you need to get them approved. That means what is given in your project requirement document, what is clearly stated in your PRD, is broken down to the last use case, functional and non-functional. It also talks about how the various actors interact with the system. And this is how the requirements are traced back sign off. So a formal sign off is extremely important for you to go to the next stage. Without a formal sign off on your requirements document, you should not move to the design phase, because you really know whether the requirements are undergoing change, or the entity relationship diagram is changing, or the data flow diagram is changing. You clearly cannot put a finger to it. You have to get them approved baseline. As I clearly said, whatever is there in the PRD, whatever is there in the management and version management, and following the 5-step review process. So along the requirements document, just to ensure that whatever is there in the PRD is covered in your use case diagram. And tomorrow, when you start doing the user testing or unit testing, you need to ensure that every use case or every requirement is traced back to the original PRD, because that is where it all started. What is including, what is in scope has to be traced, every bit of it, to the PRD. So you need to create what is called as a requirements traceability matrix. Many of the project management tools do provide that as a part of the job tracking and work breakdown structures. But I wouldn't recommend that, because yours is a very small project and you are everything, right from requirements to design to architect to project manager. I would say a simple Excel sheet should do it. There are a lot of tools available which can do requirements traceability. A lot of AI tools are also available. You can start using them as a part of the RTM. So requirements traceability matrix is very important. It's the template which I have shared you is a pretty robust template, very simplistic. You can track it using your Excel sheet. And every line item can be an hyperlink to another sheet, or could be a workbook, and which clearly, it integrates upwards and downwards. Now that you have the set of accepted use cases, what are the various steps to be followed after that? How the scope document feeds into the next phases, and what are the next phases? The next phase is that if your application is yeah, sorry, there has been some network issues. So it's very important for you to understand that a complete scope document needs to get into the next phase of design. There is an interactive application, then you need to start writing down the wireframes and the screen flows. Then you need to do the architectural design, the component level, how the components interact. Then you need to do the database design in terms of the data structures, the database layouts, the primary database, the secondary database, where the databases are stored, whether it's an off-campus, in-campus, cloud-based. Then you have the various APIs, you have various integrations. And are you using any third-party, APIs, like whether the time or KYC, Aadhaar, whatever it is, I don't know. But if there is any third-party APIs to be required at what point in time, and which application is going to invoke those APIs, or your application is writing for someone else. All these third-party interfaces designs have to be clearly articulated, including the socket programming and everything. And this is how a scope document feeds into the design phase of your project. And please understand that the design phase also has to be approved by the technology team of your consumer, in this case, your mentor, and get it approved and say, hey, I approve the technology stack in terms of the UI, in terms of the architecture, in terms of the database, in terms of the network security, in terms of various third-party tools. Once you get a sign off and baseline it, you get on to the next phase of execution. So what is also important, as a part of the overall project is you need to have a very clear testing requirements, also part of the acceptance criteria. As I said previously, the use case diagram can be so written well, it can actually be a test case document also. But in some organizations, they have an independent testing. They look at the your use case diagram and come up with their own test conditions, boundary conditions, test conditions, what is in scope, what is not in scope. You need to clearly articulate what are the elements of functional testing, what are the exception testing, what are the negative scenario testing. You also need to simulate scenarios for non-functional testing in terms of response time, in terms of database, what happens in case of a network failure. All those exception conditions, the boundary conditions to be tested. And finally, you're getting into the integration testing and user acceptance testing. When you talk about the user acceptance testing, it means that this is exactly what your user is going to accept once you deliver the project and say, this is what you wanted me to do it, this is what I have delivered. So user acceptance testing criteria has to be part of the overall testing, not only at a unit testing, it has to be at the integration testing as well as the final acceptance testing. So in terms of the completeness of the scope, you need to have functional requirements completed, all the use cases completed, you have all the non-functional requirements completed, you have the scope, boundary defined, what is in scope and what is not in scope. You also need to clearly document the technology requirements so that a customer knows under what conditions this application is going to work. So this is a summary of what you're going to do. I think for your project, I don't see more than 30 minutes of time. Maybe it take about an hour. But I think it's very important for you to take use case, write it down, model it, and get your use cases approved. Take time, but get into some serious detail about it. And that's how you learn the concept and that's how you build your skills on it. I'm going to share that requirements template with all of you. Just have a look at it and feel free to modify it, but don't cut down on the various headings I have indicated in your template. So finally, what are the key takeaways for the session today? Is that you have functional requirements. Finally, now you understand what the requirements engineering is. Right from the PRD simple one statement of a requirements, you've actually broken it down use cases, DFDs, ERDs, state transition diagrams, and everything which is functional and non-functional. Please use that use case template, some mandatory fields, use all the four modeling techniques mandatorily, follow the 5-step acceptance process mandatorily, create a requirements traceability back to your PRD is very important for you to trace it. Finally, ensure that whatever is being there is testable. So that means create that testing scope right from the unit testing to the requirements testing, to unit testing to design testing, right up to the integration testing and user acceptance testing. So these are something, check your audio standard. So I think this pretty much summarizes what the session for the day is. Uh, it's going to be a lot of paperwork. Documentation is very important in a software development space. Even though you are doing it on an agile methodology, it's extremely important that you follow all these steps mandatorily. Okay. So yeah, I think that's pretty much is the session. questions we can take for next couple of minutes before we break up. Any questions, please type it out on the chat box. So another 30 seconds, or else we can wrap it up. Yes, you will get this PPT. Don't worry. It was Nitish, right? Yes, you will get and everyone will get the PPT along with the templates of requirements document. Okay, thank you very much for your time and all the best. Start working on the templates once you get it. Okay, thank you guys. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, everyone. Yeah. So this, so the PPT and the other resources will be shared with you through the platform. Okay. Yes. So in subsequent meeting, I will guide you through like so where do you find it and like how to like so where to find the PRB documents and so where to find the templates and all these things. Okay. Yes. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.
Sessions in one.
Right, please.
It's the organization or also we have.